Welcome to this latest live chat on the Bear Cams brought to you by explore.org and Katmai National Park. My name is Mike Fitz, and I am a former park ranger at Katmai National Park, and now I work with the Bear Cams on explore.org. And today, we're going to be talking about the denning habits of North America's brown and black bears. And to help me explore that topic is a face from Bear Cam Past that many people might remember, Ranger Roy Wood, who is now with Shenandoah National Park. Thanks for joining me today, Roy.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me. This is kind of surreal for you and I to be on camera, but not to be next to one another, uh, bumping elbows and worrying about bears sneaking up on us.
Yes, and where are you standing right now? It looks like a beautiful spot.
I am in Shenandoah National Park, just a little bit north of the entrance to the park that's on Highway 211. Shenandoah National Park is in Virginia. The place I'm at is called Pass Mountain Overlook, and I'm trying to figure out how to step out of the way here. It's a beautiful overlook, as are most of them in Shenandoah. And this one is just really easy for me to get to. And there's a cell phone tower right down the hill here. And I noticed I got this in the picture. I didn't notice it when I was framing. That's my antenna. That's how I connect. But not good coverage up here, except for in these beautiful overlooks.
All right. Well, so if anyone's driving through Shenandoah today and they're driving by that overlook, make sure to honk your horn at Roy when you see him on the side of the road. So,
yeah, but
I'm excited.
I'm just standing here talking to a tree because I'm nestled up next to a tree, and people keep walking by, giving me funny looks.
Well, yeah, I'm glad that you could join me on the chat today. This is an interesting time of the year for brown and black bears, and for people who like to watch bears, because bears are at their fattest point of the year. And in fact, Katmai right now is celebrating Fat Bear Week. So it's a whole week to celebrate sort of like the robustness of Katmai's ecosystem, and you get to vote on who you think is Katmai's fattest Bear Cam bear. So I encourage everyone to go over to Katmai's Facebook page today and like the bear that you think is the fattest. So there will be 2 matchups today. So please check that out. We'll be talking maybe a bit more about that later on. Because like I mentioned, we want to explore the denning habits of North America's brown and black bears. So I brought Roy in to give us lend his expertise about bears in Virginia and black bears, and then his experience with brown bears in Katmai, working there for many years. And if you have questions for us on this topic, please drop them into the chat window if you're watching on Facebook Live, or if you are watching on the Bear Cams on explore.org. Just go to that chat window below the live cam feed, and you can drop questions in there, and then the helpful moderators from explore.org will be sending those questions to us. So again, bears are at their fattest point of the year. It's really a time to see how successful they are, but they're going to be moving into their dens quite shortly. And I think inside of their dens is a place for them to feel safe and secure amidst really a prolonged famine that happens. Perhaps to begin, Roy, though, I think we should maybe differentiate between black and brown bears in North America, because they are 2 different species.
Yeah, 2 different species, and from what I understand, they diverged something like 5 million years ago from perhaps a common ancestor. They have, aside from the size, they have different behavioral characteristics, and the black bears are much more widely spread in the U.S. than are the grizzlies. Did you want to go into more black bear biology and stuff, or?
Well, it's eventually.
Okay.
I think you touched on some important points there. They're in the same genus, but they're not closely related, like you said. Certainly not like brown bears and polar bears. Brown bears and polar bears,
right,
have been documented recently. There's been very rare instances. I shouldn't say this is widespread, but there's been some rare instances of them recently hybridizing, but that has never been documented between brown and black bears. There's some big differences though in their habitats. Brown bears are generally more can live in more open environments, especially before sort of like European settlement across North or colonialization across North America. Grizzly bears were found across much of the Great Plains, up into down into south into Mexico, up into Alaska. So they're well adapted to open environments, but black bears especially are very forest loving creatures.
Yeah, and that's definitely what we have in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. This place is known for its dense hardwood forest. When you're in full leaf out in the summer and you're hiking like the Appalachian Trail, which cuts through the park, it can be oppressive is probably not the right word, but you don't see sky. You're just in a green tunnel the whole time you go, which is like perfect habitat for these animals because black bears are while being omnivores, they eat a lot more vegetation than the brown bears do, especially the brown bears at Katmai. Something like 90% of the diet of the black bears in this part of the world would be vegetation. That'd be skunk cabbage and grasses and all kinds of forbs. And then when the berries are ripe, they love blackberries. In the fall, it's acorns, it's apples, and it's all these very foresty types of areas that where they find their wild food and where you would most likely find them.
And another big difference too is their ability to climb. We've both seen brown bears climb trees in Katmai, but
Yes.
none of them are as good as black bears.
No, black bears have shorter claws. I don't remember the exact length, but very, very short in comparison to the brown bears, and they have a little more curve to them, which makes it easier for them to climb more like cat-like or squirrel-like up the tree, as opposed to when we would see like Beadnose go up the tree, or Holly go up the tree. Actually, not Beadnose. Sorry, Holly go up the tree, where she would almost like grab it and hug her way up the tree.
Yeah, in some ways, it's almost like watching somebody climb a coconut palm or something like that to get at the
Right.
coconuts. They just have to like wrap their legs around it and pull themselves. So they use
Yep.
their claws an awful lot to do it. But black bears are exceptional climbers, really well adapted for forested
Yep.
environments. And then, how big are your black bears?
Well, just like Katmai, they're not so big in the spring and they're much bigger in the fall. But a big black bear in Shenandoah would be 350. An exceptional one would be maybe 400. I think the record though is for black bears, males is like, or do you know? I'm going to try to recall. You might have it in your notes, but something like 800 pounds for a male and like 600 for a female is the record.
That's correct. I know in Pennsylvania, where bears have a good year eating blueberries and acorns. If both of those crops are good in certain years, they can grow that large. But generally, yeah, black bears are much smaller
some notes.
than brown bears. Okay, well, I'll let you check those. But it's interesting.
Sorry, go.
It's interesting to compare the size differences between these animals, but the commonality that both of them do share is that they are much larger in the fall. The largest brown bears in Katmai are right now over 1,000 pounds, so they're some of the largest bears in the world. But when they come out of their dens in the springtime, they'll weigh 1/3 to sometimes 1/2 less. Especially if you're a female that's been nursing cubs inside of the den. And black bears will also undergo sort of similar processes.
Well, I found what I was looking for. According to the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, the heaviest female on record for black bears is 520 pounds. That was from northeastern Minnesota. And the largest known wild black bear male was from North Carolina, and he was 880 pounds. So that's getting up there into brown bear territory there.
Yeah.
I have to really wonder what that bear was eating to pack on 880 pounds in North Carolina.
I do also there. Yeah, I do remember reading about a black bear in Pennsylvania that somebody was feeding donuts, and then it came back every day and it was able to gain that amount of size. So bears, across North America are very adaptable creatures, whether they're a brown bear or a black bear. They're able to exploit different habitats. So their niches don't really overlap completely. They'll eat a lot of the same foods. They're what we would consider a generalist omnivore. So like people, they'll eat practically anything that is nutritious for them. And it's all in preparation really for hibernation. And if you have the opportunity to observe a wild black bear or a brown bear, like if you're watching the bear cams and you're kind of wondering, well, why would a bear be doing such a thing? Really try to wrap your mind around the fact that they need to eat a year's worth of food, sometimes in 6 months or less. And we're seeing bears right now sort of transition into that the period right before they go into their dens. And your black bears are probably also in this period of time called hyperphagia. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Ours is still underway. They've got a couple of months before the majority of our bears will be in their dens. So right now, it's in many ways just like Katmai. The bears are doing nothing but eating and a little bit of sleeping and eating again, trying to pack on as much weight as possible. And during this fall period of hyperphagia here, the amount of fat that they put on it's not going to be as much as they put on there at Katmai, but maybe 50 to 75, or an exceptional bear maybe 100 pounds of fat.
That's still quite a bit of fat when you think about that they weigh just 350 pounds maximum.
Right. And I would argue that it's harder to do when you're primarily doing it by eating acorns. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's kind of an important concept to consider as well. There are constraints on just how big you can grow on a largely, if you're a bear at least, on a largely diet of vegetation. Gorillas get giant, elephants get giant on diets of just vegetation. But if you're a bear, your digestive tract isn't necessarily as well adapted to handling vegetation as a lot of other creatures. I mean, you can think about a bison that weighs 2,000 pounds and they're eating practically nothing but grass. But black bears come from, they've evolved from through the realm of carnivores. So their digestive system isn't quite fully switched over to handling vegetation as well. And that's why in other places in North America, we don't see grizzly bears getting as large as Katmai's brown bears. And I actually kind of, didn't mention that. We talk a lot about Katmai's brown bears and how they can weigh over 1,000 pounds in the fall for big adult males. But a big adult male in Yellowstone would be something like, 700 pounds, maybe 800 pounds maximum. Even in the days when bears were feeding at open dumps at Yellowstone, there was never a bear that was documented to be over 900 pounds. So there are big constraints on how large you can grow if you are a bear living on vegetation.
Yeah, absolutely. If I remember, it was something like maybe 80% of the bear's diet, or 75% of the grizzly bear's diet in Yellowstone was vegetation, which put it like on par with the black bears pretty much there. They had the ability, in certain circumstances to take down larger prey and feast on a good dense source of protein and fat. But generally they were nuts, berries, and then those ones on the mountains eating the moths. They happen to find a really good fatty food source too. But yeah, a lot more work in interior Alaska and in Yellowstone to put on that weight.
And if you're a younger bear too, or a smaller bear, it's a lot easier for you to be able to sort of like make a living on vegetation. It's much more worth their while to chew on grass, gain nutrition from it. So sometimes people will be watching the bear cams and sort of worried about the smaller bears who aren't catching many fish at Brooks Falls. And while in Katmai, salmon are the bear's most important food source. If you're a smaller bear, it's a lot easier for you to gain weight on vegetation that's not necessarily as rich in calories as a salmon would be. But Roy, you mentioned something earlier that I think will be important to discuss as well, is the timing of when bears go into their dens, because it varies across North America. Kind of depends on the population. It also depends on the age of the bear, maybe, and their sex as well, whether they have, if they're a female, a pregnant female, a female with cubs. With brown and grizzly bears, it is there's a pattern where generally pregnant females go into the den first and big adult males go into the den last. Do you know if that pattern sort of holds with black bears in Shenandoah?
It does, yeah. The females with cubs would be going in first, and so that would be around here, perhaps early November into early December. This is a fairly mild climate here most of the time, and so like right now it's almost 90 degrees, and yeah, bears are in
Oh wow,
hyperphagia.
okay.
They know because of the day length is changing, but it hasn't gotten to the point where they're concerned about having to find more food than they are wasting in energy trying to find that food and fight the cold off. It's still very much summer here right now. But first, it'll be the sows with cubs. Then it'll be the other bears, as you mentioned. Probably the big difference is that there are going to be bears in. It's getting windy. I hope you can still hear. There are going to be bears
Yeah, I can
in
still hear you.
this part of Virginia that do not hibernate because it doesn't quite get cold enough, and there is unfortunately often human food around that they can take advantage of. And so we will find some bears that just don't even bother going into dens.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I had read about that in other black bear populations, like in the Sierras, like the southern Sierras and the foothills of the Sierras outside of Sequoia. There will be black bears that won't go into hibernation. Uh, a couple winters ago, I was actually in Big Bend National Park in January, and I saw a black bear feeding on pinyon nuts there. So it's middle of January, middle of the winter time, but there was an active black bear eating pinyon nuts. So food availability really does affect when and why bears enter their dens.
And I know some of the viewers are probably familiar with Shenandoah, but Shenandoah is a long, skinny park. It's 105 miles long. It's no more than a few miles across at its widest. So virtually any of our bears here would have in their range something that's outside the park, and they will often encounter, dog food, garbage, bird feeders, anytime throughout the year. So we've sort of artificially when we've moved into their habitat, we've artificially given them winter food sources, and we've also provided them ample denning opportunities. I mean, in addition to all the natural stuff, which we haven't gotten to yet, but like trees and root balls and just digging their own hole or under a little rock outcropping, they'll go in culverts, they'll go in sheds, they'll crawl under your deck. So if the weather sort of turns in December or January, there are lots of opportunities for food and for these dens nearby. And when I was looking up like what some of these other food sources provide them, I think is just so key. Like a single like bird feeder filled with bird feed might have 12,180 calories worth of seeds in it. A bear can eat that in 5 minutes and get their daily needs taken care of. Whereas if they wanted to go for acorns, in a pound of acorns, there's only 2,000, and those pound of acorns don't all reside in a plastic container, this big, sitting in someone's backyard. So it's really key for those of us that are living here to make sure that we're not, enticing bears to stay in our yards longer because of the food that we provide inadvertently.
Yeah, bears are like I mentioned before, they're adaptable critters, and they need to eat all their year's food and some just a few months. Um, so so finding those high calorie food sources is just something that they are genetically programmed to do. A lot of times people will say, they'll describe bears that eat trash or eat bird seed as less wild than a bear in Katmai that's feeding primarily on salmon, for instance. But again, the bear is just sort of exploiting its instincts for those high-calorie food sources, and if we provide them to us, we can't really blame the bear for doing
Right.
those things. Uh, so when bears are entering their dens, in Shenandoah, Roy, where you mentioned just a little bit about where they might go, um, but they're not necessarily excavating. If I understand it correctly, they're not necessarily excavating dens into hillsides. They're actually kind of seeking out cavities that might be already present in the environment.
For the most part, they're going to try to find those hollowed out logs, half hollowed out logs, rock overhangs. Love that video of the bear in the standing hollowed out tree. Uh, they they will take that easy route. They can dig, and have been known to dig, but uh, around here with a heavy forest, they may just nestle up next to a big old root ball, maybe dig in a little bit, next to a down tree. Really opportunistic, or they may show up under your wood deck in your backyard if they happen to be in that area, because they're just as likely to take that opportunity to use a man-made denning area.
And that's a big difference between brown bears and Katmai, and those black bears across much of North America. Because in Katmai, bears are not known to use tree cavities, or even really find, kind of like an overturned tree to den underneath. They are known to just excavate straight uh, into hillsides, and this is just a great illustration of that. This is a bear den that I found on Dumpling Mountain a few years ago, and Dumpling Mountain is only just a few miles from Brooks River, where the bear cams are located. And the bear just
Is
dug straight into the hillside. This is a very steep hillside, probably 35, 40 degrees of slope, and it just went back several feet into the hillside. So this is a fairly typical den for a brown bear in Katmai.
is that the one that you crawled in that you have posted the video of?
Yes, yes, that is.
Okay.
So, yeah, if people are kind of wondering about that, maybe somebody in the Bearcam audience who has that bookmark can drop that link into the chat,
Mm.
so you can get a better perspective on how sizable that den was.
Yeah, because Mike
There,
is
it
six
was, it was,
seven.
yeah. I, I may not look it. I am like a giant, but but I could fit comfortably within that den by squatting down. I didn't have to worry about my head necessarily hitting the ceiling. Uh, so it was a fairly sizable animal that made that den. But bears in Katmai don't reuse their dens either, and that's something that's a difference between Katmai bears and Shenandoah's black bears. Shenandoah's black bears may revisit certain places each year. Do you have places in the park that your biologists know, hey, this is a spot where a bear kind of goes to den every year, or maybe for decades? Bears have been
Uh,
exploiting it.
that's a good question. Now I could look in my other notes, because I had some questions for our wildlife biologist, or one of our wildlife biologists, the one who primarily deals with bears, and I'll see if he gave me those notes. I don't want everybody to stop while I look this up, but I'll see if I can find it and see if he mentioned that in the notes.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll look forward to that answer if you're able to. If you're able to find it, but certainly bears are coming up on a season of famine, naturally, across North America. In Katmai, they're fattening up, trying to put on the last uh, pounds, or as many pounds as possible before they go into their dens. But inside of the den, I mean, that it is really a place where they feel safe and secure. And for pregnant females, especially in the wintertime, it becomes almost like a surrogate womb, because they'll give birth in the dens in the wintertime. And that's something that happens with not just with brown bears, but also with black bears too. So that's one commonality that all three of North America's bear species, including polar bears, have in common, is that they all give birth within their dens.
And it's essentially the same time here in Shenandoah as it is in Katmai. which is interesting, even though our winters are way different in intensity and length. It'll be
And
January
with
to early February.
Okay. And your black bears are probably only about a pound when they're born, just sort of like a grizzly bear or brown
Super
bear.
tiny. Yeah, yeah. Still, I think it's pretty much the same ratio of pretty much fits on the mother's paw. So even perhaps a little bit smaller.
Okay. Yeah, throughout North America, this is one of the most critical times of the year for bears as they're trying to gain weight before they go into their winter hibernation. And we're not going to really cover hibernation physiology during this chat. I think that's so complicated that it needs a whole chat for just on that topic. So we'll try to cover that in a future Bear Cam live chat. But the differences between brown and black bears in North America sometimes can be quite stark when you're talking about size, but their food habits overlap quite a bit. And their adaptability, their ability to exploit new food resources, their curiosity, and everything like that. By looking at those features, we can see the similarities between these animals. And when they're going into their den, they're seeking that one place that gives them safety and security throughout the wintertime months, which in many parts of North America are just for them defined as a time of famine. With that, though, I was wondering, Roy, if you wanted to try to get to some viewer questions for the rest of the chat.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see. I haven't had the opportunity to look at the queue and see what has popped up yet. So if you do have more questions for us, I would encourage you to drop those questions in the chat on Facebook Live or on explore.org if you are watching there. And we're probably about halfway through our broadcast. So I'd like to reintroduce myself and my special guest co-host. My name is Mike Fitz, and I work with the Bear Cams on explore.org.
And my name is Roy Wood. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. And I used to work with Mike on the bear cams in Katmai National Park.
Right. Yeah. So if you think that I'm not the right guy for the job at Katmai, you can blame Roy for that, because he was the one who threw me on the webcams. So it's great to work with Roy again. And he's our special co-host to help us talk about the denning habits, not just of brown and grizzly bears in North America, but also of black bears. We did have a couple of questions that came in sort of really early. And these ones maybe I'll take, Roy, and you can add your insight too, because these are about Katmai's bears specifically. Because you worked at Katmai for 13 or 14 years, I think.
13.
And somebody was actually wondering, is it unusual to see bears at Brooks Falls at this time of the year? Within my experience, we always sort of saw bears fishing at Brooks Falls in September, but not as many as we had seen early this September. There was a lot of bears fishing at Brooks Falls this September, and I think that just had to do with a really large run of silver salmon, also called coho salmon, that moved into the river. And I don't know, if you had ever seen a year where there was exceptional numbers of silver salmon, Roy, but this year especially, it seems like there was just a lot of that species of salmon coming in late summer.
Well, I always wondered what we would find out when the cams were out there, because typically you and I left September 22nd-ish. A few years we stayed on a little while longer. Maintenance folks were on a little bit later than that, but then there was perhaps a good part of October where nobody was going up to the falls checking. And I recall only one time before the cams happened that I went to the falls, rode out in a boat. It was and it was Columbus Day weekend. We went out there, and there were one or two bears at the falls and a few fish jumping. So I didn't know at the time if that was an anomaly or not, but I did see it at least one time before the cams arrived that bears were using that area. But even when the cams came, we didn't see that many. Maybe they would pass through.
Right. It's something that is not necessarily that well known because the bear monitoring program at Katmai sort of ended in early October. Again, not a whole lot of staff at Brooks River through the end of September, and a lot of staff that were focused on different things. So we are still learning quite a bit about the habits of the brown bears at Brooks River, and the cams I think are really helping us to learn more. So I'm excited to watch. Throughout the rest of October to see just what what surprises will show up. And we've also been seeing a lot of salmon staging still at the mouth of Brooks River, and that is something that I do think is fairly normal at this time of the year. So, if you want to see, the great views on the underwater camera, I'm not sure if it's gone live today. I'm not sure if there's enough solar power to boost the signal again or energize the system. But go to the underwater camera on explore.org, and you can see it's almost like you're sitting in this aquarium surrounded by salmon. It's been really great, and most of the fish that we've been seeing on that camera recently have been silver or coho salmon. So that in itself is not necessarily unusual. During our broadcast earlier, we talked about how brown bears will excavate dens into a hillside, and sometimes black bears will do that too. Also, but they'll seek out tree cavities or go underneath the roots of trees for shelter. Maybe even use rock crevices or something like that. But somebody was wondering, do cubs or yearlings ever help dig the den? I have not read anything that suggests that is something that they do, but I would imagine that maybe cubs, since they are so curious and mimic the movements of mothers so much, that they may try to do it like like a child helping their parent in the kitchen. And Roy, I don't know if you have any insight on that or not.
Well, I was going to say the same thing. We see them mirroring their mother quite frequently in behavior. Even sometimes just like mom stands with her right foot up on her toes sometimes. We see them do that. So I could absolutely imagine that they learn a great deal from being up there, maybe playing with their siblings and then seeing mom do it and then dig a little bit in the pile of dirt that she's dug up. But I have never seen it, and that's something for the dumpling cam to keep looking for. Maybe we'll see actual digging of a den at some point.
Yeah, and I have actually not read anything in any of the scientific literature about bear denning habits that would suggest that the dependent offspring are actively sort of working to dig a den with mothers. So they're probably allowing mom to sort of take the lead in that sense. But brown and grizzly bears keep their cubs generally longer than black bears too. So your black bears in Shenandoah are only with mother for about a full year. So they have a really short window to kind of learn the lessons necessary to survive. How long do they stay with their withers?
Year and a half is the norm. Every once in a while, one will stay a little bit longer. Mother will keep cubs a little bit longer, but for the most part, it is just a year and a half.
Okay. So yeah, big difference between the brown bears in Katmai, who generally keep their cubs for 2 to 3 summers. So if we see yearlings on the camera right now, then they may be on their own next summer for, again, yearling brown bears in Katmai. And if we see spring cubs, we can expect those spring cubs to come back with mother next year. So she won't separate from them. And throughout North America, brown grizzly bears and black bears, they will separate from their cubs in the springtime after they emerge from their dens. And Roy, I think this question might be, let's see if you can tackle this one. Somebody was wondering if the mild winter last year and the very wet summer this year has impacted, the forage available for black bears in Shenandoah. You were telling me last night that you've received a huge amount of rain recently, and I didn't realize it was that wet in the east this year.
Up in the park, we hit, I believe the last count was about 72 inches for the calendar year. which is a good like 14 inches, 12 inches more than what our previous record was. And so what that has meant here is that we have lots and lots of really lush green foliage. The bear crop was outstanding this year. The acorn crop was great. It was a little too wet in the spring for some of the plants. Like trees lost some leaves because of a fungus problem, but everything is super lush and super green, and so I know we have a great bumper crop of acorns this year. The bears are doing quite well feeding on those.
Yeah, so since bears are so adaptable in their diets, it's it allows them to maybe focus on a different food resource if one happens to fail. So they're not necessarily specialists in that manner. So they don't necessarily, not like an insect that has to feed on the leaf of this one tree at this one point in time of the year. So their overall sort of like place in the ecosystem is much broader. So if the acorn crop fails, and maybe they are able to eat blueberries, for instance. So that helps them to be able to still gain the weight necessary to survive.
Right. Yeah, a good part of the summer, like maybe 4 to 6 weeks at Big Meadows, which is in the central part of Shenandoah National Park, we had almost every afternoon two family groups that were visible out in the meadows, and they were just going back and forth from eating blueberries, blackberries, and digging up ant hills and eating the ant larvae. So just
And
back
that,
and
yeah,
forth,
that's
whatever
actually,
food they could find.
yeah, something that the bears in Katmai don't exploit as a food source in preparation for hibernation is insects. In Katmai, I think I saw one ant. There might be like one little tiny species of ant, like the one that crawl on your kitchen countertops or something like that. But there's rarely colonial insects or social insects in Katmai for bears to eat. We sometimes will see some paper wasps or things like that, but not very many. But when I've been hiking in my neck of the woods near the North Cascades, for instance, I would routinely see ground nesting bees, their nests ripped up, and just a swarm of bees on the ground. And that's from a black bear that happened to sniff out the nest and dig it up and eat the larva. So ant hills and ground nesting bees can be really important food resources, really high in calories and protein for a lot of bears throughout
Yep.
different parts of North America. And I think we covered this a little bit during the chat itself, but it might be good to revisit just how much weight do bears gain before going into their den. So you mentioned a big black bear, a big male in Shenandoah, Roy, will be around 350 pounds or so.
Yeah.
As a percentage of body fat, you think that's about a third body fat maybe?
Yeah, that sounds about right. And they're going to gain about that much in fat a year, about a third, 25%.
And that's sort of right on par with brown and grizzly bears as well. So when they come out of their den, they're going to weigh about a third less, at least, than what they weighed in the fall when they first went into their den. Let's see. And what might happen, and this is something that we sort of have to speculate about, but what might happen if a bear doesn't gain enough weight before it enters into hibernation? Does that change its behavior at all?
Well, it might stay out longer looking, and just keep trying, and maybe become a little more adventurous in what it's going to try to do. It may start inside the park, whether that's Katmai or Shenandoah, and if it doesn't have enough body weight, and it's starting to panic, and it catches wind of a dump, or it catches wind of a barbecue, or a bag of dog food, or a thing of birdseed in the yard, in somebody's yard, it might be drawn to that, and in attempts to put on enough fat to make it through hibernation.
So I think bears are when they're hungry, they're sort of desperate animals in the sense. I don't think they're necessarily feeling desperation, like and conceptualizing it like we do, but probably inside of their bodies, it's really kind of in panic mode if they aren't able to eat enough food because they know that famine is coming. They've
Yep.
experienced that every year of their life, so it's really really important for them to try to gain as many calories as they can. Hibernation, I should say, is probably their best energy conservation strategy because they can lower their metabolism something like 75%, even though their body temperature only drops, just a few degrees on average. So they can really, really save a lot of energy by going into hibernation. But if they go into the den sort of not at their ideal weight, they are going to come out skinnier in the springtime. And springtime can be a really hard season for a lot of bears, especially in Alaska, like in Katmai, where there's not a lot of rich food resources. It might be a little bit different for you, as you were mentioning earlier, Roy, in Shenandoah, because things tend to green up much, much quicker in the springtime.
Yeah, and you're. I was going to make the point that you did, that you don't want to come out too early especially if you're a bear in the far north. And so I always wonder what sort of chemical cues or hormonal cues or inner dialogue the bear has when it's trying to decide, do I have enough? Should I go in now? Is this going to be enough to get me all the way through the season I need to? I'm not saying it's a conscious thing, but somewhere in their bodies are sending signals, and I always wonder what that is like that tells them that this is the point. No matter how hungry you may be or how much more fat you thought you needed to get, now's the time to go in the den.
And if you've been watching the brown bears on Katmai, excuse me, on Katmai's bear cams, you see some exceptionally fat bears, and I think they do really. Yeah, this is great illustration of bead nose here. They sort of set the curve for what a fat bear can be. Most bears get by with less body fat than a bear like bead nose or 747 or Otis at Katmai. So sometimes you'll see a bear that looks thinner. That doesn't necessarily mean that bear is unhealthy. It just doesn't have access to the same amount of really rich, easy to catch food, just like the salmon at Brooks River. And here's an interesting question. We often see bears go out of the den or come out of the den in the springtime looking a lot leaner, a lot thinner. But it looks like cubs keep on growing in the den. And is that true? Will cubs keep growing in the den in the wintertime?
Well, one would hope they do, since their mothers are feeding them that super rich bear milk all winter long, and so yeah, when they're in with their mothers, they have the ability to continue nursing.
Yeah, so spring cubs will nurse in the den as they continue to grow and gain weight. When they're born, they of course are only about a pound when they come out of the den. For a brown or grizzly bear, they may weigh 10 to 12 pounds or so. So they'll grow quite a lot in those first few months. But when older cubs go into the den, they're still growing, even though they might not necessarily be exploiting mother's milk while they're in the den as older cubs. Unlike humans, bears don't really lose their muscle mass while they're in their den. They're able to maintain muscle mass, and they're also able to put some of that fat reserves into growing their bones, recycling the calcium that's within their bodies so their bones don't become weak or brittle. So they will actually, be able to continue growing while they are in the den. And I was even reading recently about how they are able to heal wounds while they're in the den too, even though their circulation is extremely limited. Because both brown and black bears, when they have, when they're in hibernation, full hibernation mode, their heart is only beating like 8 to 10 beats a minute. Still able to heal surface wounds and abrasions, cuts like that on them. So that's a really remarkable ability that they have. And I think, Roy, if you maybe we could stick around and try to answer a few more questions over the next 10 minutes, since we got started a little bit late with you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And again, if you joined us a bit late, Roy Wood, the Chief of Interpretation and Education at Shenandoah National Park, is my special guest co-host today. He's also the former Chief of Interpretation at Katmai National Park. So he's very familiar with Katmai's brown bears and also now with Shenandoah's black bears. And my name is Mike Fitz. I am a Bear Cam Fellow with Explore.org, and I'm also a former park ranger at Katmai National Park. So what would so Roy, a question for you: what would be the most caloric or calorie rich food for bears in Virginia might that they might find? So what would be, we talk about bears in Alaska. Salmon is obviously like pound per pound like their go-to food source. But what about black bears in Virginia?
Well, in their native food, it's going to be all the nuts that they eat. Acorns, hickory nuts. Um, uh, if you're looking at the non-natural bear food, it's going to be a lot of that processed human food, and bird seed is going to be the most calorie rich. I Something like a 3 pound can. This is on this. I didn't memorize all this. I have a table from the web
Cheater.
that has what the caloric content is of a 3 pound can of shortening, for example, 12,430 calories. So a bag of dog food, 42,425 calories. So those sorts of things are far and away the most calorie rich, which really speaks to the strong desire of bears to keep frequenting an area when they've gotten a bag of dog food, a bird feeder, broken into somebody's pantry and gotten food out of their cabin. But in the park, it's going to be acorns and hickory nuts, things like that are going to be the most calorie rich.
And there's, yeah, I mean, when, since humans only eat a little bit of food at a time, and we stay active all year, I think sometimes it's hard for us to sort of really wrap our minds around the mindset of a bear trying to gain fat for winter. When you throw out those statistics about how much calories are in a can of cooking oil or something like that, or full a bird feeder, it really is remarkable. A whole salmon at Katmai, fresh from the ocean, a whole sockeye salmon, about 4,500 calories. So if a bear can get to a bird feeder in Shenandoah and eat 12,000 calories, it's almost like it's eating 3 salmon. And it doesn't have to work nearly as hard. So that is kind of some remarkable statistics to help us understand why bears would be bold enough in some cases to try to exploit human food resources. Roy, there's probably not a lot of competition for denning habitats throughout Katmai or in Shenandoah. But somebody was wondering if bears ever get attacked by other bears in dens. Have you read anything about that happening in your neck of the woods?
I have not heard of that happening in Shenandoah, and I heard of it happening in Alaska, where brown bears would dig black bears out of their dens and eat the black bears. That was documented a couple of times by a film crew working in Lake Clark back about 5 years ago. And it's been observed other times, but evidently they got some pretty good footage of it.
Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. I think overall, I think it's fairly rare, but the possibility, exists. So yeah, quite interesting. It could happen, but bears don't tend to necessarily den close to one another either. The dens are well hidden; they're fairly secluded. But bears have a really remarkable sense of smell, so they're not necessarily hidden from each other because of that.
Yeah, pretty much. There's man is the only predator of bears when they reach adulthood, with the exception of perhaps other bears on rare occasions. We did have right in front of Big Meadows Lodge this year. We did have a male bear successfully kill a cub. In front of a whole bunch of people. So we get that kind of
okay.
infanticide, just like Katmai occasionally gets. So I
Yeah,
have
and that did
bugs
happen at
crawling all over me.
Okay. Well,
Stink
maybe
bugs, my favorite.
are those the brown marmorated stink bugs that have invaded the east, or is that you're
Um,
looking at a different species?
they've invaded my backpack right now. I don't know
Okay.
the species on them. Um, do you know them if I put it in front of the camera?
Oh, I probably won't do that, or I probably won't know, but
Okay,
but I like seeing
they're
different critters.
everywhere.
So okay. Let's see. We'll try to answer maybe a couple more questions here, and before we go for the day, Roy, I do have a special question for you that I want to ask.
Okay.
Um, so actually, this one is for Roy. So have you had any close encounters with black bears while you've been in the park? I was actually kind of wondering how often um, you might see black bears in Shenandoah. So if somebody took a drive on Skyline Drive, for instance, would it be likely that they would see them, or they would just have to get lucky?
Pretty likely. If you are being alert as you're driving, looking deep into the forest, which can be hard to do, especially later in the afternoon. The bears are much more active, at least in the summer months here. Let's say like 4 o'clock on in the afternoon. Shenandoah has between 400 and 600 black bears, which is a density of the size of our park is something like 2 bears per square mile, which is
That's
pretty
a very
good.
high density.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there's a really good chance you'll see them when you drive. And for did you see something just go in front of the camera? That's a stink
Yes.
bug.
Yes. Okay.
um, the Because the density is so high and because there's so many visitors coming to the park, especially this time of the year, it's really important that people are really alert for bears and other wildlife in the road and drive the speed limit, which is 35 miles per hour or less. Even with that greatly reduced speed limit in Shenandoah National Park, we still have at least 25 bears a year that are killed by motor vehicles in the park. So it's really, they're out there. I see them maybe half the time I come up into the park, and I usually just come up, do something quickly, turn around and get back out. And I can pretty much guarantee if I'm driving the length of the park, I'm going to see at least one. But to the question about my close encounter, really the only close encounter I've had, because these bears are much more skittish than like the bears around Brooks Camp were. The only real close encounter I've had was during our butterfly count this year. We were out in Big Meadows, and I was walking over to a beautiful cluster of milkweeds because we were, counting all the butterflies. In particular, I was looking for monarchs, and so I could see all these butterflies on this vegetation, and I started traipsing out through about belly button high vegetation to get to it. And then I saw a couple of heads stick up in ears, and then a couple of more, and it was a sow with 3 cubs. At that point, I was probably about 40 yards away, and she just dropped back down and kept. She was digging up, turning over logs and rocks and getting the ants out from underneath. So very focused on her food. Just checked to see where I was, and then went on with her business. And that I think brings up a behavioral difference between black bears and brown bears, and that they are not protective of their young to the same degree that brown bears are notorious for, or grizzlies are notorious for. They typically will send their cubs up a tree, and of course we all know the stories about getting between the mother and her cubs or getting too close, how bad that can be. It just doesn't happen to that degree with black bears. Much more accepting of us. Well, that's not the right word. They don't react violently usually when we get close.
Yeah, their encounters with black bears tend to be they tend to show less defensiveness, at least from a physical standpoint, as a brown or grizzly bear mother. But it's also really important that we consider just giving these bears space, no matter where we happen to be, no matter their tolerance level for people, because they really do need these habitats to survive. And without a park like Shenandoah, for instance, providing this corridor, along a ridge line in the Blue Ridge, this really important habitat corridor, you probably would not have nearly as many black bears living in that area. So national parks are great places to visit. They're places for us to sort of reflect on the landscape and relax. enjoy nature, but they're also extremely important habitats for the animals that are often, surrounded by a sea of humanity otherwise.
Yep.
And I think we maybe have time for just one more question. And this one I did want to ask Roy at the end of the chat. So this is Fat Bear Week, of course, as many of you know. So I do encourage everyone to go over to Katmai's Facebook page and vote for the bear that you think is the fattest. But I want to know if Roy is willing to throw his endorsement behind any one particular bear. Have you looked at? I don't know actually how often you were able to watch the bear camps this summer, but do you have a favorite for this year's Fat Bear Week?
So I have a need for some clarification. Is this who I want to win or who I think will win?
You could do both. I say, for me, the answer is the same for both questions.
Because
but yeah, you
it's
could do
science, right? It's
both.
got to be the one. So the one who I think will be the fattest bear is the one that I have felt has been the fattest bear for a number of years, and he sometimes gets slighted, or maybe every time. I can't remember what his score is, but 747 is the one I think will be the fattest when all is said and done. He's not the one I want to win it because I have a soft spot for underdogs. And so I saw that the 503 was